I'm going to be talking about variants in Figma, just a quick guide on how to use variants. I guess that half of us know what variants are and we are already using variants in our projects, but still, like for the people who doesn't know, and even some tips that I'm going to be sharing, maybe know some people doesn't know them. So I just made a presentation with a bunch of slides. I've stolen most of the graphics from all the sites and everything. I've cited them at the end of the presentation in case you want to check the original websites. I'm going to get started with what are variants. And variants are a way to group and organize variations of the same components. Previously in Figma, if you had like different states for a button, for example, you would have to create different components for those states. And you can't group them only by its naming conventions. Like if you use a certain criteria for naming those buttons, you can search for them in the side panel, but it's not as powerful as creating an actual group where all of them are contained. So two main concepts to understand about variants are properties and values. Those two things allow you to define attributes in variants. And you can add as many properties and values as you need and customize them. They can show in the form of a dropdown, or you can create a switch. And how to make a switch? If you create a new property and instead of using a random name, you just use true or false or on and off, then it creates automatically a switch. And you can see that switch in the side panel when you select. I'm going to be showing that with a project. Here's an example. So if you select a button or a label, see that in the side panel, you have a switch instead of a dropdown. And that is more usable, like for some scenarios, some use cases. One last tip is that we discovered that if you have a lot of variants and those variants are independent components, if you need to make a global change, you have to go one by one and make that change. But let's say that you're going to change the radius or the coordinate radius of a button, or you're going to add an extra icon, or you're going to change like the font in the label. You would have to go one by one and make all those changes. And it can get wild because these variants can be exponential. So a new variant is a combination of different properties. And if you have a lot of properties, then it gets wild. But if you create a base component, like if you create a base master component that lives outside variants, and then those variants are an instance of that component, then you just make those changes in one single component, and it will reflect in those variants. I'm going to be showing some projects to show you like how variant behaves in practical world. Let's say that we start with a button and we already defined the padding, like using auto layout. We selected a font, a background for the button. We're going to create that main components that with where all the variants are going to be associated with. We had a button on the left, an icon on the left, and an icon on the right. And we create a component. Then we're going to just copy the component to create an instance of that master component. And we're going to create another component with that instance. So we create that component. And we're going to go to the right panel and we're going to hit just add new variants. Let's say that this property is going to be related to the left icon, right? So we're going to start with on. We're going to click on the whole group just to rename that property. That is just called property one. So we kind of call it left icon. And we're going to click on the second variant. And we're going to set left icon to off. And we're going to select by clicking through, we're going to select the left icon and just hit the delete key, a keyword, and we're going to hide that button. We're going to make sure that the first one has that property is set to on. And we're going to add another variant that doesn't have the right icon. So again, we go to the main group, which is all the variants. That's the only place where you can edit the properties name and how you handle them. And we add a new property that is called right icon. And this one is going to have left icon on and right icon off. And we are going to hide it. We're going to do the same process that we did with the other one. We're going to hide the right icon. And now we need one which has the label. So we're going to add another variant. Right icon is going to be off and left icon is going to be off too. And we're going to hide both. And now if we create an instance of any of those variants, just by copying and pasting that component outside of that group, we can come here. Oh, I just did something wrong. This should be on. We go to the funnel and we just hide the things that we don't need, or show the things that we need. And because we have these base components outside, let's say that we need to change like the font in all the buttons, all variants. So instead of going one by one and selecting all these and changing it, we're going to change it just in this base component that is outside. Let's use like a regular and I don't know, 18 pixels or 24. Yeah, and I think that's it. At least that is what I was planning to show you guys. But let me know if you have like any questions.
I have one question actually.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do you start building the system in your process of variants, right? Is it after you get the approval from the look and feel of the client?
Oh, you're talking about like when you start a new project and
right.
At one point we start. Well, actually, if we have the approval for a certain flow, or like we have the approval to go forward with a proposal, what I do, and I think that is the same for all of us in the team, what we do is to create like a very basic design system with the things that we need, that we definitely gotta be needing. Like we're gonna be needing style guides and buttons and icons. So we start like putting together all of this that is very basic. And I don't create components until I get approval. If I need to create a more complex molecule, like a card or anything like that, I don't create a component right off the bat. I just create like an object, a group, a frame in Figma. And once I have the approval, I go and I add it to the design system.
Okay. Yeah, I think at least thus far, it's been most helpful of like, you're kind of done with that area. And then in the future screens where you just need a bunch of instances or whatever, then it just makes like that faster. So it's like after it's like totally solidified.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good call out to make the parent component, because that's not, at least from like the initial stuff that Figma released. I don't know if that was encouraged, but that does, at least when I played with it, that does simplify things a lot. And sometimes having like nested components where, I don't know, just variants, they can exponentially increase so fast that, yeah, you have to break them up like a little bit. That was just something that stood out to me that is a good call out, is making a master component.
I think that's super good, because like you guys can imagine, as you add more things to this, if you wanted to add a hover state or an active state, you would need to make 4 versions of an active state of all of those different states. So you don't want to have to move around those icons every single time. But if you have a master component that's just being referenced, if you ever need to change those icons, you can just do it in one place and it's going to update everywhere. And so you can just hide the layers in the variant rather than having to just like completely make new elements for every variant that you create.
Exactly. And here's a good example. This is the design system for Figma. It's very powerful. It has a lot of components, but this button is like it doesn't have a base master component that lives outside, and it doesn't have a right icon. So I needed a right icon, and you can imagine that I won't be going one by one and adding that icon and changing the color of the icon depending on the state of that button. And it's just crazy. So if this thing was made with a base component outside and all these variants were based on that component, then it would have been super, super easy to go to that component that just add the icon. But here we wouldn't have that ability. And this is also a good example of how exponential can get when you start creating like variants for each single combination of properties.
Awesome. Well, Matias, thank you so much for showing that. You definitely know variants inside and out. So if anyone has any questions on that, Matias is definitely one of the go-to guys. They can kind of be confusing for sure, especially if you're layering in that extra, master component. But once you wrap your head around it, I think variants are great.